In July 1940-4, deep in the jungles of Burma, Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi gripped a radio dispatch, his hands trembling. 80-5,000 men had crossed the river to launch the offensive, and now more than 50,000 were casualties. Not from bullets, but from hunger, malaria, cholera, from a supply line that had run out of food 2 months ago. He had issued each soldier only 20 days of rations for a campaign he believed would end in weeks. He told his men, and himself, that fighting spirit would fill the gap. It did not. The dispatch in his hand was the order to retreat, and after reading it, he wrote one final command of his own. A last message from a general to the soldiers, dying in the jungle around him, an order you will hear in a few minutes. When you do, I want you to sit with it, because it is not the order of a madman or a fool. It is the order of a man who built his entire career on a belief that worked every time against every enemy. Until it met the American military of 1940-4, 3 men, 3 moments, and each time, the same thing they had no name for. A general in Burma who watched it destroy his army and blamed his own officers, a warm minister in Tokyo who understood it completely, had seen it with his own eyes and could never say so out loud, and a wounded sailor on Iwo Jima who encountered it in a field hospital tent. From a medic with a smile and a pack of cigarettes, the story begins in Burma, March 1940-4. With a general and a plan that should have worked, March 8, 1940-4, the Chindwin River, Burma. 80-5,000 Japanese soldiers began crossing, with no roads for trucks and no railroads to support them. Supply lines would move by ox cart, by horse, and on the backs of men, over mountain passes more than 6,000 feet high. Through jungles so dense that lead units sometimes had to hack their way through with machetes. Mutaguchi knew every one of those facts. His own chief of staff told him directly the supply lines are too long, the terrain will not support vehicle resupply. The men will run out of food before this is over, but Mutaguchi listened, then said, "Can we not fight without supplies?" The Imperial Army endures every hardship. He issued each man roughly 20 days of rations to take an objective he believed would fall in 10. 4 days of margin was his entire buffer for everything he had not predicted, and Mutaguchi was not an incompetent man. That point matters. He had taken Singapore in 70 days, among the fastest conquests in the history of modern warfare. He had driven the British out of Malaya using bicycle infantry, a tactic so absurd that even his own Haikam and thought it was ridiculous until it worked. He had defeated better-equipped, better-positioned, better-fed armies again and again, and every time the pattern held. Apply pressure, move fast, and the enemy breaks. The British broke in Malaya, they broke at Singapore. Mutaguchi had spent a career learning one lesson from war: spirit beats logistics, and he was right every time, until Imphal. British and Indian troops fell back toward the plain as expected, and Mutaguchi watched the reports and waited for the moment he had seen so many times before. The moment when pressure becomes too much to bear, the supply line snaps, and the defenders have no choice but to surrender or be overrun. But that moment never came. Because the defenders were not relying on a ground supply line. Every day, the RAF and the Americans were flying in everything the garrison needed. Food, ammunition, medicine, over the course of the entire siege, the numbers were staggering: 14 million pounds of rations, 1 million gallons of petrol, 40-3 million cigarettes, 12,000 replacement troops flown in while the battle was still raging, and 1,200 bags of mail from home. Soldiers under siege, surrounded on all sides, were receiving letters from their wives and children while they fought. Mutaguchi had never encountered this, not once. He had beaten the British in Malaya when their supply lines ran on roads he could cut. In every campaign he had ever fought, severing the supply line and defeating the army were the same operation, but here they were not. The army was on the ground. the supply line was in the sky, and he had no aircraft capable of stopping it. While the surrounded garrison grew stronger each day, his own men were eating the draft animals, first the oxen, then the horses. By April, men were wrapping cloth around their feet because the jungle had dissolved their boots. Malaria was spreading through units faster than any order could follow. Dysentery, beriberi, men who looked able to march in the morning were delirious in the mud by afternoon, and Mutaguchi sat at headquarters issuing attack orders. He fired the commanding general of the 30-3rd Division for lack of fighting spirit. He fired the commanding general of the 15th Division for the same reason. The commanding general of the 30-1st Division, Lieutenant General Koto Kusato, sent a message back since leaving the Chindwin: "We have received not one bullet, not one grain of rice." He was fired, 3 divisional commanders, 3 months, all relieved for the same reason: lack of fighting spirit. I have read a lot of military history, and I have learned to be careful about judging men in wartime. The margin between a hard decision and a catastrophic one is often thinner than it looks. But there is something Hirai keep coming back to. Mutaguchi's chief of staff told him before a single soldier crossed that river the terrain will not support it. The men will run out of food. He heard it, he nodded. He signed the orders anyway. That is not blindness. That is something harder to name. After the war, researchers collected the diaries of men who died on the retreat. One entry was written by a medical officer in late June. Somewhere on the jungle track between Imphal and the river, he wrote, "The soldiers who fall beside the road, no one has the strength to lift them. I have no medicine. I have no bandages. I no longer have the strength to stand upright. That is the end of the story." That is not the language of a man lacking spirit. That is the language of a man who has arrived at the wall of what a human body can do. No general's order passes through that wall. General Sato refused the customary invitation to commit seppuku and demanded a court-martial instead. He wanted to stand in front of a tribunal and put Mutaguchi's orders on the record for the Japanese military to see, but the court-martial never happened. Military doctors examined Sato and declared him mentally unfit to stand trial. He had suffered a breakdown under the stress of combat. Sato's complaint about Mutaguchi never entered the official record, because if it had, the questions that followed would have been impossible to contain. July 8, 1940-4, for months after 80-5,000 soldiers crossed the Chindwin River, the retreat order came. Of those 80-5,000 men, more than 50,000 were casualties, the majority from disease and starvation, not combat. Only 600 were taken prisoner. The rest who survived, roughly 12,000, walked back over those mountains on their own, abandoning their wounded along the way. Because the column could not stop, Allied forces following the retreat found the dead on both sides of the trail for miles. Before giving the retreat order, Mutaguchi issued one final command to his men: if your hands are broken, fight with your feet. If your hands and feet are both broken, fight with your teeth. If there is no breath left in your body, fight with your spirit. He sent this to men who were dying of starvation in the jungle. After the war, Mutaguchi was held by Allied occupation authorities in Singapore. The evidence against him was judged insufficient for prosecution. He was released in 1940-8. He lived until 1960-6, 80-1 years old. He never publicly accepted responsibility for what happened to more than 50,000 of his men on those jungle tracks. A Japanese novelist later claimed that Mutaguchi distributed pamphlets at veterans' funerals insisting he had actually won at Imphal. Historians have not been able to confirm this, but what is not apocryphal is this: he had 20 years after the war, more than 50,000 men, 20 years of silence. It would be easy to stop here and call Mutaguchi's story about one man's arrogance, but that is not what this is. Because 12 months after he was standing in that jungle holding a retreat order, the most powerful general in the Japanese military was sitting in a room in Tokyo. Not with reports of defeats, but with something far more direct. He had watched from a calm and post as an American general bypassed his entire defensive line and isolated 40,000 men. He had watched the reports from those soldiers come in, then slow down, then stop. He did not need an intelligence briefing to understand what he had witnessed. That man's name was Korechika Anami, and his story is where this gets harder. Mutaguchi's failure is painful, but it is legible. He believed a theory that had worked for years. He did not see what was different about Imphal until it was already killing his army. Anami's story is not like that. Anami saw what he was dealing with firsthand, in real time, 13 months before anyone asked him whether Japan should fight or surrender. He saw it from a headquarters in the Pacific, watching an American general do something that had no precedent in any war doctrine Anami had ever studied. Not attack harder, not fight longer, but move sideways, leave the strong points behind, let the supply lines do the killing. What Anami understood from New Guinea, and what Mutaguchi never grasped from Burma, was that the American military was not trying to defeat Japanese armies. It was trying to disconnect them, cut them off from the food, the ammunition, the medicine, the replacement parts, the blood plasma, the mail. Everything that allows a fighting force to remain a fighting force. An army that cannot receive is an army that is already dying. It just does not know it yet. Anami knew this. He brought it back to Tokyo in December 1940-4, and every morning for the next several months he stood up and argued the opposite. November 1940-3, General Korechika Anami flew into Davao in the southern Philippines and assumed command of the 2nd Area Army. Responsible for western New Guinea and the Halmahera Islands, his orders were to stop MacArthur's advance up the New Guinea coast. But MacArthur did not advance the way Anami was trained to stop. He did not grind through Japanese defensive positions one by one. He identified where Japanese forces were concentrated and landed his troops somewhere else entirely, behind the lines, beyond the perimeter. At airfields the Japanese considered too far from any threat to bother defending. The Japanese called it leapfrogging. What it actually was a method of using logistics as a weapon. MacArthur would seize a position, build or repair its airstrip, fly in fuel and ammunition, and use that new base to support the next jump, which the Japanese would not see coming because they were still oriented toward the last one. April 20-2nd, 1940-4, MacArthur's forces landed Halangia, more than 400 miles behind the nearest Japanese front line. The landing caught the Japanese entirely off balance. Fewer than 1,000 combat troops were defending the area. Within hours, 50,000 Allied soldiers were ashore. Within days, the 3 Japanese airfields at Halangia were in American hands. The Japanese 18th Army, roughly 50,000 men, was now cut off between the Allied landing force at Halangia and the Allied forces advancing from the east. They had no naval support, no air support, no supply route. Anami's headquarters at Davao received radio reports from the encircled units. Then, the reports slowed down, then they stopped. He could not relieve them. The distances were too great. The Americans controlled the sea lanes and the air. Any response he organized arrived somewhere the Americans were no longer standing. The 18th Army would spend the rest of the war trying to march overland through some of the worst terrain on Earth. Of the roughly 50,000 men trapped, estimates suggest only a small fraction survived to the Japanese surrender in 1940-5. Anami watched this from a desk in Davao. He could not stop it. He could not change it. He could only watch the reports come in and then watch them stop. In December 1940-4, he was recalled to Tokyo. He returned having watched something that cannot be unlearned. An army is not just the men holding rifles. It is the entire chain of things behind those men: the food, the fuel, the orders, the communication. Break that chain and the men with rifles become irrelevant. Their courage does not matter. Their discipline does not matter. Their fighting spirit does not matter. They are simply waiting to die. A staff officer at the War Ministry named Raoki Katsu later recalled that Anami said to him privately in late night 1940-4 that Japan could not be defended against an American invasion, not a tactical assessment, but a statement of physical fact from the man who would command that defense. If Rao's memory is accurate, Anami walked into his role as War Minister already knowing the answer to the question he was being asked to fight over. April 1940-5, Tokyo, the night of March 9th, 270-9B-20-9s dropped incendiary bombs on the city. More than 80,000 civilians died before dawn. Some estimates run as high as 100,000. 16 square miles burned to ash. It remains the deadliest single air raid in the history of warfare. More people killed in one night than at Hiroshima, more than at Nagasaki. Okinawa is falling. The Imperial Navy has ceased to function as a fighting force. American submarines have cut off oil imports. Training flights for new pilots have been severely curtailed. Japan is running out of fuel to teach people to fly. Into this, Anami is appointed War Minister, the man who would decide whether Japan continued fighting. He pushes for Operation Kaetsu-Go, the decisive operation. The plan is not built on any realistic hope of winning. Japan cannot American production. Both sides knew the arithmetic. Kaetsu-Go's logic was different if an American invasion cost a catastrophic number of American lives. The American public might lose its will to continue. The war might end in a negotiated settlement rather than an unconditional surrender. The plan calls for 12,000 kamikaze aircraft and thousands of suicide boats. Fortification of the beaches at Kushu, women trained with sharpened bamboo, children taught to carry explosive charges into tanked Reds. National radio broadcasts the slogan "Glorious Death of 100 million. The man who designed this strategy is the same man who watched MacArthur cut off 50,000 Japanese soldiers. He knew what a disconnected army looked like from the inside. He pushed for Kaetsu-Go anyway. There is no clean way to explain that. All the explanations that exist, duty, honor, giri, the impossibility of changing course inside the system he served, are true, and none of them fully account for it. August 6, 1940-5, a single American B-20-9 drops a single bomb on Hiroshima. When the report reaches Tokyo, Anami refuses to accept the initial assessment. He argues that the Americans cannot possibly have such a bomb, that the reports are exaggerated, that Japan should not negotiate on the basis of one attack. 3 days later, a second bomb falls on Nagasaki. The same morning, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan and begins moving into Manchuria. The Big Six meet in emergency session. They have been deadlocked for months over surrender terms. Now the deadlock holds even with to atomic bombs and Soviet entry into the war. 3 men want to fight on. 3 men want to accept the terms. For the first time in modern Japanese history, they bring the question to the emperor. Hirohito speaks. He accepts the Allied terms. Anami sits in that room and listens. He had served Hirohito as a person allied minus Dean Inus camp in the 1930s. He knew this man in the way that very few people ever know a sovereign, not as a symbol, but as a person who paused before speaking and chose his words with care. When it was over, Anami walked out of the room and said one sentence to his brother Minus in Minus Law. Colonel Takashita as a Japanese soldier. I must obey my emperor. On August 14th, he signed the surrendered document with the rest of the cabinet for a August 15th, 1940-5, Anami dresses in his full military uniform. He goes to his bedroom at the official residence in Kaimakai, kneels on the floor, writes several notes. One is addressed to his son. One expresses gratitude to the emperor. The last one, the one found beneath his body, reads, I, with my death, humbly apologize to the emperor for the great crime. Nobody has ever settled what the great crime means. The language is not ambiguous. The meaning is, It could mean leading Japan into a war it could not win. It could mean failing to secure an honorable peace before it came to this. It could mean signing the surrendered document. It could mean the weeks he spent considering a military coup to prevent the emperor's broadcast and then stepping back from it. It could mean something he never wrote down and never told anyone. Or it could mean something simpler and more devastating than any of those. Knowing, for more than a year, what was coming, and standing up in front of the Supreme War Council every morning to argue against what he knew. The ritual was not completed correctly. It took nearly 3 hours. His brother Minus-in-Minus-Law, Colonel Takashita, was with him the entire time. Anami's sword, his blood-stained dress uniform, and that handwritten no tar on display today at the Yushukan Museum in Tokyo beside Yasukuni Shrine. Millions of people walk past them every year. Most know Anami as the war minister who opposed surrender until the emperor himself intervened. Few know about the come and post in Davos, about the reports that slowed and stopped, about the man who had already seen what the American system did to armies that had nowhere left to turn. The note says the great crime. The note does not say which one. I think about Anami sometimes when I read about people who see something clearly and have no way to say it, not because they are cowards, but because the system around them has no room for that particular truth. No language for it, no channel through which it can move upward and become policy. The cost of that silence is never just one person's to pay. Mutaguchi's army died in the Burmese jungle, and he lived 20 years in silence. Anami watched 50,000 men get cut off in New Guinea, carried that knowledge back to Tokyo, and spent the last year of the war defending a strategy he knew would not work, both of them commanded from above. Maps, reports, headquarters, strategy sessions. The war reached them through paper, but there is a question their stories do not answer. What happened when an ordinary Japanese soldier, not a general, not a war minister, just a man who had been told since elementary school exactly what kind of creature an American soldier was, found himself face to face with one, not in combat, in a field hospital tent, wounded, captured, certain that what came next would be the worst thing he had ever experienced. From the time they entered school, Japanese soldiers were taught a specific word for Americans' kikiku. The closest English translation is something like demon beast. It was not informal slang. It was the term used in official materials, in school lessons, in military training. Americans were ikiku, creatures without mercy. Japanese troops were told that Americans tortured prisoners, mutilated the dead, executed men who surrendered. This was not invented from nothing. The result was that almost no Japanese soldiers surrendered, not because they were not afraid of dying, they were, but surrendering to an American was not a way to survive. It was a way to die more slowly, in worse circumstances, with shame attached. Haruji Mita was a first-class seaman on Iwo Jima. The island is 8 square miles of volcanic rock. Kuribayashi's garrison of roughly 20-1,000 men had spent months digging tunnels. The Marines who landed on February 19, 1940-5, had been told to expect the battle to last 5 days. It lasted 30-6. Mita's leg was wounded during the fighting and became severely infected. He was captured unconscious, unable to resist, unable to even know it was happening. He woke up in a United States field hospital tent. An American corpsman was looking at him, smiling. The man handed him a pack of cigarettes. His leg was cleaned and bandaged. He was given a blood transfusion, American blood, from American donors who had no idea where it was going or who it was keeping alive. After the war, Mita said from elementary school, we were taught that Americans were ikiku. We heard what our own soldiers had done to Chinese prisoners. Though we feared the Americans would do the same to us. He paused. Then he said, I felt ashamed that I had believed it. Japanese POWs became the most valuable intelligence source in the Pacific Theater, unit locations, troop strengths, defensive plans, command structures. Information that took weeks to extract from prisoners in other theaters came out in days, sometimes hours, from Japanese prisoners who had received decent food and a functional latrine. Not because of any sophisticated interrogation technique, because someone had given them a cigarette and treated their wounds. That is the American system at its smallest scale. Not a factory, not an airlift delivering food to a besieged city, one corpsman on the forward edge of a battle, in a tent on an island the size of a small town. Doing what he had been trained to do without anyone watching, without any expectation that it would matter strategically. It mattered strategically. Harry Fukuhara enlisted from the Gila River Relocation Center in Arizona. He had been born in Seattle. He was 20-2 years old. His father had died when he was 13. His mother had moved the family to Hiroshima. Harry had grown up partly in Japan, graduated from a commercial school there, and returned to the United States in 1930-8. When the war started, he was living in California. He was sent to Gila River. He enlisted anyway. He trained at Camp Savage, deployed to New Guinea in 1940-4. Letters written in the same characters his own mother had written to him, the same handwriting style, the same paper sometimes, that came from the same prefecture. He did not know during the war whether his family in Hiroshima was alive. On August 6, 1940-20-9 dropped an atomic bomb on the city where his mother and brothers lived. Fukuhara was in the Philippines, preparing for the invasion of Kyushu, an invasion that would have put him on the same beaches where one of his brothers was training to defend. The invasion never happened. After the surrender, Fukuhara traveled to Hiroshima to find his family. He found his mother and his brothers. They had survived the initial blast, though they were suffering from radiation effects. His older brother Victor died shortly afterward from radiation sickness. Harry Fukuhara outlived Victor by 70 years. He died in 2015 at 90-5 years old. In Honolulu, men like Fukuhara did not fight for the country that had locked up their families. They fought because, inside the American system, that was what you did when your country needed you, even when your country was wrong about you. That is how deep it ran. That is what you cannot manufacture in an army built only on orders and spirit in the fear of dishonor. You build that over generations, in courtrooms and classrooms and dinner tables, in the accumulated expectation that the system, imperfect, often wrong, sometimes cruel, is still worth serving. Because the alternative is something worse. No doctrine teaches that. No training program produces it. It either exists in a society at every level, or it does not. Mutaguchi sent his army into the jungle to defeat a machine with willpower. Anami spent what remained of the empire on one final version of the same wager. Mita lay unconscious in a field hospital tent and woke up to find that everything he had been taught about the enemy was wrong. The Japanese built an army to win through spirit. The Americans built something that could outlast it. Spirit ran out at Imphal. It ran out at Halangia. It ran out at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And on the retreat roads through Burma, where men died of hunger in the jungle while a surrounded garrison 60 miles away received 1,200 bags of mail from home. The system, the one that flew food to surrounded soldiers, trained a corpsman to smile at the enemy he had just captured, and sent the sons of incarcerated families to read the diaries of the men they were fighting. That system did not run out. If you want more stories about the forces that shaped the Pacific War, hit that like button and subscribe. Your support helps this channel keep bringing you the history they do not teach in textbooks. I am your strategy observer, and I will see you on the next battlefield, where the systems that men build will once again determine whether spirit alone can carry the day. In November 1940-1, a month before Pearl Harbor, the United States Army opened a secret language school in an empty aircraft hangar at Crissy Field, the Presidio of San Francisco. For instructors, 60 students, 50-8 of them were second-generation Japanese Americans, most from West Coast families who had come to the United States in the 1910s and 1920s. 6 months later, the first class graduated and deployed to Guadalcanal. Then Executive Order 9's Eero 66 was signed in February 1940-2. Japanese Americans living on the West Coast, citizens most of them, born in the United States, were ordered to report to assembly centers and from there to incarceration camps. The school itself was forced to relocate because the Army had just classified the students' families as potential security threats. It moved to Camps Avage in Minnesota, later to Fort Snelling. Nearly 6,000 people graduated over the course of the war. Many were recruited directly from the camps where their parents were being held. He spent months interrogating Japanese prisoners, translating captured documents, and reading the private letters found on enemy soldiers, letters written in the same characters his mother used. The system that flew food to surrounded soldiers trained a corpsman to smile at the enemy and sent the sons of incarcerated families to read the diaries of the men they were fighting. That system did not run out. Iwo Jima today, once a year, American and Japanese veterans gather on that ground for a joint memorial ceremony. Old men, fewer every year, standing on black volcanic rock in the Pacific sun. No speeches, no flags crossed ceremonial, just the wind and the ground and the men who were there. Anami is buried at Tama Cemetery in Tokyo. Mutaguchi died in 1960-6. Harry Fukuhara died in 2015. Mita, the sailor who received American blood on Iwo Jima, survived the war. He said afterward that he felt shame at having believed what he was taught, and something he did not have a precise word for. What none of them ever said out loud was, "This your grandfather, your father, the man who wore that uniform, he was not just fighting for his country. He was part of what those three men, each from his own angle, kept running into and could not name. He was part of the reason the mail got through." He may have thought of himself as just a soldier doing a job. He may never have connected what he did to the broader structure it was part of. But that structure, and his place in it, is what these men, each from his own position in the war, looked at across the Pacific and spent years trying to find an answer for. They never found an answer. The Japanese built an army to win through spirit. The Americans built something that could outlast it. The cost of that silence is never just one person's to pay. Mutaguchi's army died in the Burmese jungle, and he lived 20 years in silence. Anami watched 50,000 men get cut off in New Guinea, carried that knowledge back to Tokyo, and spent the last year of the war defending a strategy he knew would not work. They never found an answer, and perhaps the answer was never something that could be found in words, only in the accumulated weight of small acts repeated across a continent and across an ocean.